And at 20, when she was home for Thanksgiving, she was walking off her Thanksgiving turkey and walked around the corner to a mosque. The guys at the mosque saw her walk in and said, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Yes." And she walked out a Muslim. The first time I met her in 2009 in Kuala Lumpur, she said to me, "I make my way from the outside." So she is comfortable in the margins, but at the same time, she and many people have noted that if she were white and if she were male, she would probably have a chair at an Ivy League university by now. And she went in and had to have a press conference and then gave a khutbah and then led a prayer with cameras clicking. There were protesters saying she wasn't a Muslim and saying this is not our Islam and so on. For Amina herself, she did it. And then she was a single mother and had to get home to relieve the babysitter. And I was like, "What did you do after you made history?" She said, "There was a load of laundry I had to do."
You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan. Kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back, friends, to Wise Women with Daisy Khan. Not long ago, a prominent American scholar named Yasir Qadhi made a comment that set off a firestorm. He said something to the effect, "I don't know of any women at the level of top-tier Islamic jurist authority in the modern era." And you know what happened? Women were furious. I was confused. Was he erasing women's scholarship? And others just said, hey, he was just describing institutional realities, not the theology itself. Here's what got me thinking. Akram Nadawi documented over 8,000 women scholars in Islamic history. And personally, I can name 30 living Muslim women theologians, scholars, Quranic interpreters, and jurists myself. As I was writing my book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women, I know who these women are. 30. So why doesn't Yasir Qadhi know this? That's the question I've been asking myself. And so this is exactly why I brought my most amazing guest today, Carla Power. She is a 2-time Pulitzer finalist, award-winning journalist and author, and I've known her for years. And you might know her from her previous book called If Oceans Were Ink. But today we're talking about her newest book. The book is called Lady Imam, a biography of Dr. Wadud, the woman who famously led a mixed-gender Friday prayer and has spent decades reinterpreting the Quran through the lens of justice and women's full humanity. Carla, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
My question to you is, what made you write a biography of Amina Wadud? Specifically, was there a moment where you thought, oh my God, her story really needs to be told?
Well, like the rest of the world, I first learned of in 2005 after her infamous prayer at St. John the Divine, where she led mixed sex Friday Jummah prayers. I met her in 2009 at Feminist Conference in Malaysia and was immediately struck by how she was surrounded by women, young women mostly, whose lives she had changed. And it was then that I started pestering my agent and saying, look, there really needs to be a biography of this woman who has reunited so many people with their Islam. And I asked Amina, and she said yes.
Oh, wow. That's great. Those people who were alienated because they couldn't understand how Islam could be so misogynistic. And because I know a lot of people who read certain scholarly works and they say, wow, I can't be part of this faith because it's really against me as a woman. That's what she was doing?
Absolutely. I think her first book, the 1992 Quran and Woman, all over the world, I have talked to people for whom reading it was an absolute game changer in terms of how closely they could embrace their faith. There were some people who said, she has reunited me with my Islam. I wasn't able to participate fully because I was so confused and alienated by some of the interpretations I'd found. And Amina brought me back, is what I keep hearing over and over again. This is from folks from, Kerala to Arkansas.
Yeah, so she brings you back to the spirit of the Quran, which is completely egalitarian. And we know that those of us who read the commentaries from great scholars, we see that there is no place for misogyny in Islam and women are co-stewards. When I read that book, I was like, oh my God, why didn't I read this before? But nobody told me to read that book. So let's go back for a few seconds to her beginnings, to Amina, literally the child. And from your book, you said she grew up in poverty, but then she wound up in one of the best universities in America. How did that happen? Who helped her? Who was that mentor or guide who came along?
She had extraordinary beginnings grounded in piety and religiosity because she was born in Silver Spring, Maryland, one of 9 children, the daughter of a Methodist preacher. And it was really a pretty hard scrabble existence. But she was in the middle of the woods, learned to love nature. And after a serious amount of trauma, they were thrown out of their house and were homeless for a while. Spent a summer living in a shack that her dad constructed and moved through the fields. Ended up in Washington, D.C., all living together. And her mom ran off for a year. But her dad got her family into 2 rooms at the top of somebody else's house. And she started going to school in D.C. And though her grades were indifferent, her parents didn't really think about education a lot. A junior high school counselor noticed that her test scores were off the charts. This kid was incredibly bright. And this fairy godmother was named Sarah Moultrie, took her under her wing and said, you should really do your homework. And Amina was a self-taught reader, just read everything, discovered the public library in DC, and was ravenous, intellectually curious, reading everything from Ramona the Pest to Nancy Drew and other things. And so that helped her too. Sarah Moultrie got her sent to a special program that still runs today called A Better Chance, which gives young minority kids chances to go to really elite prep schools. And Amina went for a summer course at Mount Holyoke. So she's 14, Mount Holyoke, the girls' college in New Hampshire, and the world cracked wide open for her. By happy circumstance, her counselor there was Barbara Smith, who would go on to be one of the founding mothers of Black feminist discourse later. And Barbara was 19, Amina was 14, and suddenly she was going to dance concerts at Jacob's Pillows and reading Shakespeare and performing in plays, and discovered. So from there, A Better Chance got her place for 4 years in Weston, Massachusetts, which is Oat Wasp, one of the most affluent zip codes in the United States. She lived with a series of 5 families, all white. She was one of 3 Black kids in her high school class. And so she basically, as she says, I desegregated Weston High School. But she thrived intellectually and got into full scholarship to University of Pennsylvania and just tore up the academic track from then on in.
And she studied Islamic studies because for her to be interpreting the Quran, she would have had that academic background.
Yes. She got her BA in education from University of Pennsylvania. It was when she was 20 years old. She had been raised in Christianity. When she went to college, she was interested in all sorts of Eastern religions, briefly became a Buddhist, and had hippie days in California. And at 20, when she was home for Thanksgiving, she was walking off her Thanksgiving turkey and walked around the corner to a mosque. And they saw this young woman who was dressed very modestly at the time, because that was the
Methodist way.
A lot of young Black women dressed very modestly in the 70s to differentiate themselves from this mainstream white teeny bopper micro
hippie crowd,
shorts. Amina did it to honor her ancestors, who she said were stripped on slave auction block, who did not have choices to cover up their bodies. And so she did it from Black Power perspective.
Wow.
But the guys at the mosque saw her walk in and said, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Yes." And she walked out a Muslim and then embarked on her path.
So it was her own personal spiritual seeking combined with reading text, because she already came from a family where text was probably very much part of her father being a preacher. What was it that kind of led her to reinterpret the Quran? Because at this point, she would have been reading the Quran and seeing certain things in it, and she must have studied Arabic for her to reinterpret the Quran. Was there a moment that lit the fire in her where she felt frustrated by the classical exegesis and how women were portrayed?
I should start off by saying it took her 6 months after her conversion before she got a Quran in her hands. And when she started reading it, she fell in love. She had never, in all her years as a Christian, felt the direct connection that she did in reading the Quranic text. So it was, as she says, a lifelong love affair between her and the Islamic scripture. There were various moments along the way where she was confused by a teacher's interpretation of a particular text. She studied Arabic in Cairo, and there's a scene in the book where she and her Quran tutor there cross paths over the discussion of slavery and whether female slaves are male property or not sexually. And that was her first kind of confrontation with interpretive differences in terms of the Quran. I think Quran and Woman started off as her University of Michigan PhD dissertation. She went along having not had preconceptions about this text. I mean, it wasn't as though she read the Quran at her father's or mother's knee, you know.
Yeah.
So she came to an interpretive openness that allowed her to read, you know, things like the story of the Queen of Sheba being a great leader rather than, as she's often portrayed in historical tufts, you know, not being a leader, but just sort of falling into the luck of finding Islam. So Amina would really stress that leadership. That was just one of the many times that she was like, this is how I read it.
You're right, because people just gloss over the part where the Quran talks about her being a wise, astute leader who averts war. She's like an archetype of leadership. I'm so glad that Amina did that, because now we have scholarship to back it up. Was there something that she did that became the breakthrough verse for her?
For her, the breakthrough was after she wrote her dissertation and assumed
a PhD.
And said, okay, all right, I've done my PhD. This will get me a job and I'll just put it on a shelf. And the job she got was in Kuala Lumpur at an Islamic university.
Oh, wow.
And while there, she met a small group of women, mostly lawyers, but journalists and social workers as well. And they had gone to Quran school on Saturday mornings in their youth. But there was an aggressive new political Islam that was creeping in Malaysia in the 80s and 90s. And they were meeting and they were confused because this seemed so unlike the Islam that they had grown up with before the Iranian Revolution, the more sort of muscular political Islam that came in. Amina fell in with them and said, they began reading the Quran with her. And it was their lived experiences as lawyers, as journalists. They would hear these stories from women who were finding themselves having their divorce rights taken away, having their inheritance rights threatened, having a much more punitive atmosphere in Malaysia during those times. And with neo-traditionalists on the airwaves and in the courts, telling women that they should stay at home. And so these women began going through the Quran with Amina. And the first verse they tackled was the one on polygamy. And they sat down, and these women all assumed that 4 wives are a hard and fast rule for Muslims.
And a right for every man.
Right for every man, exactly. And yet they sat down and read the first part of the verse, which says, you may take 2 or 3 or 4. And then they went on and saw, but it cannot be fair to them.
And just and fair, yeah.
Just and fair, it is better to take only 1.
Yeah.
And they're like, wait, what? Really?
And how about the part that says that a man can only contain 1 love in his heart? And how about the fact that you have to take care of the orphans, and the reason why you're marrying these women is to safeguard orphans?
Exactly. The discourse around them had been all about, yes, men can take as many wives as they want, and if they want younger wives. And these women who had seen the pain in real lives were then able to take the text and go show their Zaina Anwar, who was one of the original sisters in Islam, tells a wonderful story. The day after they had the Quran session about polygamy, she took her Quran into work. And there was a man who she knew to be a bit of a flirt and possibly a philanderer. And she went up to him and she said, look what I learned in Quran last night. Look at it. And he would not even look at the text because
we're so afraid.
It undermined his notion of what his God-given rights were.
That is very threatening to men because you can't even discuss it. They're just like, oh, I just have the right. And I said, no, you don't have the right, because you only have 1 heart and you cannot have 2 loves in 1 heart. I'm talking about the kind of love you have with your wife, not with your child.
I have to say, I did not know about that verse.
So now she's actually made her mark and she's cooperating with the civil society people. I have had experience with that as well, because I've worked with a lot of scholars. And the scholars often tell me, I wish you guys were by our side, because we are in the ivory tower. We are writing these things without knowing what the issues are at the ground level, whether it's polygamy or it's domestic violence, or how is the text being interpreted by men with outdated attitudes towards women. I'm so glad that she did that, and I can almost imagine what these women in Malaysia, sisters in Islam, must have found. Like, oh my God, there's actually divine justice that we can use that's embedded in our scriptures. That's so great. It's so empowering because now you have God as your authority behind you.
Exactly.
I'm also slightly curious. Her work is very well known in academic circles. If anybody's ever doing research, PhDs, you can see her cited in almost all the papers. She's invited to a lot of conferences. She's come to the WISE conference that I held. But in many Muslim communities, nobody knows her name, with the exception of maybe somebody who likes reading books about women in Islam. So honestly, I'm just asking this as a broader question that applies to other religions as well. What happens? Is it gender or patriarchy? What is it that is behind this erasure of women's history, or women theologians, or women who have a seismic role to play in how you think about religion?
That's a book
in itself.
In and of itself. I mean, I think, that there are in various faiths, there are various reasons for the erasure or the ignoring of women's voices in faith and out, in offices and families elsewhere. Certainly, I remember when I worked with Sheikh on If the Oceans Were Ink, that was one of my main questions to him. You found 10,000 women scholars. And he said, like, in centuries past, it was often cultural, that because men were very much seen as the head of the family, and there was a notion of parda, they often did not want their wives' names mentioned or sisters' names mentioned. That was conceived of as a sense of protection. And so women's names were often not recorded. When someone comes along and says things that are different and are challenging to a status quo, the status quo often ignores them. And she has gone along and has, for better and worse, refused to play nicely with others if it contravenes with what she sees as truth and justice. She is not afraid of speaking out. The first time I met her in 2009 in Kuala Lumpur, she said to me, "I make my way from the outside." So she is comfortable in the margins, but at the same time, she and many people have noted that if she were white and if she were male, she would probably
Convert,
have
white male convert.
if she were white or even brown and male, she would probably have a chair at an Ivy League university by now, given the sort of contribution she has made theologically, not to mention her activism. I very much think that sexism is at play and racism, and the fact that she speaks her mind within academic circles as well as beyond them.
Which is so ironic because, as Akram Nadwi wrote this volume of thousands of women, from Aisha to Asma, her pupil, Fatima, I'm just like mentioning a few, right? There were many that he hasn't written about. But that's the confusing part. You have such a rich history of women who had male pupils. These were people who were studying under the feet of women. And yet you have now, today, where you are questioning whether a woman can even be a scholar. So going back to the margins, and it's usually people on the margins that come and shake the whole status quo. What can people learn from her example? She is on the margins, and she is reforming the faith tradition from within rather than abandoning it altogether. I find that to be the most fascinating thing, because when the change is created from within, it is very effective because it speaks to the tradition and it refreshes the tradition and it gives it life.
I think her importance is often reduced to, the 2005 prayer, and she's about women in Islam. And that does her a great disservice. I see her very much as groundbreaking intersectionalist. She started off a Salafi. She was running around Martha's Vineyard in a niqab and was very normative in her approach. As she moved through these evolutions of her relationship to faith, it got broader and broader and broader. Once she set up her idea of the Tawhidic paradigm, where Allah is above and all human beings are then on a horizontal plane beneath Allah, she was able to think about social justice in terms of no white should be over a black or any other color. She was able to think about it in terms of sexualities, that a straight person can't claim to be better than a person of another orientation. So it is, her theology allows us to think very broadly about how humans relate to each other, not just how men and women relate to each other, but rather what should be one's orientation as a human being on this earth. And in that sense, it's incredibly universal and a really powerful schema for equality and justice.
Her interpretation about the nafs, how each human beings are created from one original soul, that broke all the boundaries that people had created. Like Adam was created first, then Eve was created from the rib of Adam. And I don't know how we Muslims got that, because it's not in the Quran, but we kind of borrowed it from the previous scriptures. And for me, that was also a major breakthrough when I read her book and the original nafs, that we were created from one soul. And that's what makes us all human. That's what breaks down all of this upmanship. I'm better than you, white is better than black, and man is better than a woman, that kind of stuff. It all dissolves, right? Because we're all created from the same soul.
Well, and that's one example of a reading of hers that was a breakthrough and is now in the mainstream. I would argue that she's much more mainstream than many give her credit for, because I'm sure most mosques in America and elsewhere would be talking about the nafs and that equality.
Just to talk about women scholars in general, right? The first time I saw 434 verse regarding domestic violence interpreted differently was from Lali Bakhtiar, who came to my conference in 2005. And she announced that she was translating the Quran, and she had translated this verse very differently than what people were accustomed to. Oh, beat your wife. No, she said, no, walk away. Women cheered and they went berserk. They couldn't believe it, that it was a false translation that was responsible for women getting beaten up. And now there are so many Qurans that are interpreting using that interpretation. And it took 20 years for people to adopt this. So whatever she has written now, it may take time, but it'll eventually trickle into the community because it's the truth. We have to bring it to them.
She's a master of rhetoric. And she knows that saying something in really bold ways, and she's willing to be that pioneer, and knows eventually more and more people will sit down quietly and read what she's written as opposed to reading the headlines or looking at tweets or Reddit threads. Mm-hmm. If you take away all the hullabaloo that has surrounded her repeatedly, the stuff she's saying, certainly in Quran and Woman, it doesn't seem controversial now.
So I just want to go to that controversial moment in her life that kind of was life-altering in a way. This was 2005. I was very aware of this because I remember getting a phone call saying that this is going to happen in a church on a Friday. So it was a Jummah prayer, which was a mixed-gender prayer that she led. And the Muslim world lost its mind. You were a journalist. I don't know if you covered it, but it was in every newspaper, you name it. It was the hottest news ever.
Absolutely.
But something happened to her. So I just want you to explain what she experienced on that day and subsequent to that, what happened to her family, what actually happened to her.
She brought her will with her on that day up to New York. I interviewed her 5 children, and her eldest, Muhammad, said, I knew she was nervous when I saw her twisting her silver rings and the fact that she had brought her will. But she had actually done a mixed-sex khutbah in South Africa in 1994. And that had caused a hullabaloo in South Africa. But of course, this was an entirely global stage that she stepped into. On March 18th, 2005, it had been well publicized. Asra Nomani, whose brainwave it was and who was organizing it, is a journalist, thought it was very important that this was seen. And there were banks of press waiting to interview her. There were protesters outside. Amina is a very shy woman and likes to pray alone, likes quiet contemplation, and was determined that her prayer would be between her and the divine on that day. And she went in and had to have a press conference and then gave a khutbah and then led a prayer with cameras clicking. There were protesters saying she wasn't a Muslim and saying this is not our Islam and so on. For Amina herself, she did it, and then she was a single mother and had to get home to relieve the babysitter. And I was like, what did you do after you made history? She said, there was a load of laundry I had to do, which to me speaks volumes. While she was doing that load of laundry, the shot, it rang around the world. And even before the prayer, there were fatwas being issued saying a woman does not have the right to lead Friday Jummah prayers. There were denunciations from scholars at Al-Azhar and elsewhere. She was teaching at Virginia Commonwealth University, and this is in the post-9/11 era, so they were concerned about safety of both of students and Amina. So she taught by video link, which was not common. Police surveyed her house for strange cars. There were online death threats that she pretty much ignored. When she spoke in Turkey a few months afterwards, they got her an armored car, which she sort of rolled her eyes at, but it made her a household name in many Muslim households. And it started her icon status for many Muslims who were looking for gender equality. It also made her infamous in the eyes of folks who did not want to see a woman imam.
Were there people who were quietly supporting her but publicly staying silent because they knew people who were very liberal, open-minded, knew that she had just broken major ground. Like the first time somebody kicks the door, gives permission to a lot of other people to walk right behind. And so she did that. that also revealed that very famous hadith of the Prophet who allowed a woman to lead prayer. That stuff was hidden from view. And as a result of her action, it all came out. And now more and more women are doing khutbahs. There's a mosque in California. I was invited to do a khutbah there, but it's mostly for women. But still, there were some people that used to say that no, a woman cannot even lead prayer for women. That was the stage that we were at. So forget about mixed gender and that woman has no role per se. But that's just not how things were at the time of the Prophet and subsequent eras. And you spent a lot of time with her. Is there something that you saw that changed how you see faith, courage, and your own work?
Oh, great question. It was an incredible privilege. Amina and I talked regularly, at least a couple times a month for 6 years, and I learned a tremendous amount from her. For me, as an American, she realigned my sense of what it means to be an American. She taught me so much about the breadth of how to engage with American traditions and about the possibilities for an ever-widening spiritual path. Her path went from Christianity to Buddhism to New Age seeking to getting ever more inquisitive and ever more questioning. That to me, as a non-Muslim who has a spiritual side, but I don't follow any particular faith, that seeking has been tremendously influential and powerful.
Wow. It helped you also on your own journey.
Absolutely.
Because you are somebody who has been observing the Muslim community. You've written lots of articles. Thank you so much for your wonderful work. I consider you to be my favorite journalist when it comes to Islam because you actually get it. You take the time to understand this tradition from within. So if you had to speak to the Muslim community, what would you say to them, especially those who kind of marginalized women, why it's important to honor her contribution? You may not agree with her, and we have a very rich tradition where we have so many different schools of thought. We don't agree with one another, but still we honor the people that made the effort, that came to a conclusion. You may find fault with that conclusion, but nevertheless, it's our tradition. She followed every methodology. And how do we recognize the courage and the scholarship that she has contributed to? But really, also from the perspective of an outsider, how would this recognition help shape how women are viewed in Islam by the general public?
I would hope that the Islamic tradition of respecting good intentions and serious intentionality when coming to interpreting the faith, which seems to be a really lovely and important tenet of respect for your fellow human beings and their thought, and also recalling how diverse in the early centuries ideas and interpretations were. And that rich, sometimes fractious history should be the spirit with which one approaches Amina, who can seem very out there. But again, I would just urge people to try to suspend what they have read online and in the newspapers and turn to Quran and Woman. And if they can stomach that, turn to Inside the Gender Jihad and look at what she was trying to do. Also, she brings such wide-eyedness about lived realities to her interpretive practice. You cannot disentangle her being a Black woman in America or a single mother and 5 from what she reads in the scripture. And that is a really interesting learning tool for other interpretations. There's a wonderful story about her she was teaching in South Africa. And there was an imam who sent a bunch of his students to basically tear down her ideas. And she started talking with them and talking about curiosity. And one of the young men said to her, "But you could be wrong." And she said, "Of course I could be wrong. But we need to look at all different interpretations. I want thousands more interpretations." And that sort of broadness of spirit in a world where the Ummah is truly global and dealing with all sorts of different ways to interpret and different interpretive communities. Whatever you think of her conclusions, her process and what she brings to it is worth thinking about as we all try to think about Islam in the 21st century and beyond.
Well, thank you so much, Carla, for joining me. And listeners, I hope you will pick up Carla's book and maybe consider inviting Carla to your places of worship or a Zoom session just to deepen this conversation, because it's Amina's journey, but there's much more here. It's her journey, and it's the journey of how women in general have played an outsized role in theology, and that needs to be recognized and acknowledged and applied in many cases, because in his work, she delved into very deep questions about authority, equality, and the role of conscience in religious life. And that's what the world desperately needs right now. So I thank you very much, Carla, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you, and definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter, and your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. So let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.